Play as you go. I woke up in his bed at 6 o'clock the next morning, my head stuffed with happy haze. He was breathing regularly beside me, and I stared at his tousled head and toned bare torso as I reviewed the facts in my head. Yes, I had slept with him, despite my long-standing policy of absolutely never sleeping with anyone on the first date. On the positive side, I had accurately determined that he didn't have any relationship-ending perversions right off the bat. If he had been into anything weird, immediate sex would have brought it out, which meant that in some ways it was a wise vetting tactic. And we'd use protection, of course. On the negative side, RG had just sworn me to be wary of all Bremen staffers. I was now lying naked in bed with one of them, which suggested I'd let my guard down just a tad. Had I just slept with some sort of enemy? Had James Carville and Mary Madeline felt this way after their first night together? Even if they had, they'd clearly managed to make their relationship work. And Aaron and I had the advantage of working for people who were supposedly on the same side. I decided not to dwell any more on the negatives because I wanted to stay in my pleasantly glowing good mood, and the night really had been fun. It was also a stroke of good luck. A stroke of luck, parentheses, good old accurate fortune cookie, close parentheses, that I had waken up before him, because being awake first was the only foolproof way to ensure that he didn't observe me snoring indelicately. Plus, it granted me a little extra time to plot our morning after interaction, as much as I was able to, at least. Oh Lord, what would happen when he woke up? Would it be weird and awkward in the champagne-less light of day? How much time did I have here? When did he get up for work? Did my breath smell horrible? Could I slip into the bathroom, rustle around for some mouthwash, and slip back into bed to pose myself attractively without disturbing him? I made it 2/3 of the way through my plan before stepping on something sharp on my way back to the bed. I yelped and brought my foot up to rest on my knee as I examined the damage. A mangled paperclip that had embedded in the carpet had pierced the soft skin in the sole of my left foot. I extracted the paperclip and was trying to inspect the wound when I lost my balance and tumbled into a small pile of laundry that was neither soft nor aromatic. Perhaps the yelp had woken him up, perhaps the thud of my still naked body hitting his floorboards had, but regardless, Aaron was soon standing over me with the sheet wrapped around his waist. "Are you okay?" he asked. He looked both puzzled and concerned. "Totally fine," I said brightly. "Just attacked by a vicious paperclip," I explained as I pointed to the offending slip of metal. I stifled a gasp as I realized my mother was a psychic genius. Granted, it hadn't been an oversized paperclip, but probably any danger to her only child's well-being loomed larger than life in a mother's subconscious. The important thing was I had been mauled as predicted. I needed to call and inform her of her miraculous talent at the first opportunity. "Gosh, I'm sorry," Aaron said. "I should really clean up around here." He helped me to my feet as I stood close to him. As I stood close to him, I wondered if my freshened breath could make him forget that his first postcoital image of me had been my awkwardly splayed body entangled amongst his dirty laundry, and not the planned, angelically sleeping with sheets snaked seductively around me pose. He was kissing me, so there was hope. Could we have a leisurely morning and maybe even commute to work together, I wondered? Even though I knew I couldn't possibly wear my Batter skirt to the office without attracting unwanted attention. Still, maybe we could lie in bed a while longer and he could play with my hair. I'm afraid I've really got to race to the office today, he said ruefully, politely nipping my fantasizing in the bud. Oh, yeah, me too, I said definitively. He helped me gather my clothes and call the cab. He tried to give me money for the fare, but I refused to take it. After sex on the first night date, I really wanted to avoid any behavior that made me feel even vaguely whorish. He didn't press me to accept it, but he did say he'd call me later and gave me a lingering goodbye kiss. I walked into my apartment 15 minutes later, feeling a bit disheveled and hungover, to find Shackleton floating belly up in his fishbowl. I instantly dissolved into tears. My poor, brave fish had died alone. The one night in the course of his time with me that I hadn't slept nearby. Had my overnight absence been too much for him? Had I been knowingly regenerating his will to live and thoughtlessly shirked my duty? The guilt came streaming in. Sure, he had overcome tremendous odds and lived much longer than any of his predecessors, but he still led a tragically short life, and I felt responsible. After leaving a mucousy and somewhat accusatory message on Mr. Lee's store's answering machine, I went to Shackleton's bowl to fish him out with the net. As soon as the plastic touched his body, he gave a little start, righted himself, and swam to the bottom of his bowl. I was so shocked I shrieked for the second time that morning, and I was not a shrieker. What the hell was going on? Shackleton's gills were still mossy, and his swimming seemed a bit labored, but he was undeniably alive. I never see him do any sort of belly-up napping maneuver before, and though I was overjoyed at his second resurrection, I had the uncomfortable feeling he had just been trying out his death position in preparation for the inevitable. Like people who plan their funerals to the extent of testing out the feel of different coffins. I scattered some fish flakes into his bowl and dried my tears. Shackleton would live to swim another day. I felt relieved, though also exhausted and slightly dizzy, thanks to the morning's mood roller coaster ride. As I got ready for work, I tried to recapture some of my original morning bliss by thinking about how well Aaron and I seemed to fit together in almost every way. We obviously had some issues to work through in terms of our professional allegiances, but everything else had been perfect. His arms had been surprisingly strong, surprising only because his suit shirts hadn't hinted at what a fine physique they covered. Those arms would be perfect for loading our bags on top of our sleek yet sensible station wagon when we took our 3 children on vacation to the gorgeous coastal town, where our comfortable but not ostentatious second home would be waiting for us to fill it with joyful laughter. But I was really getting ahead of myself. There was a wedding to plan. I felt a momentary pang of betrayal when I realized I was imagining saying I do to someone other than Steve Martin, whom I had consistently fantasized about marrying since I was 12 years old, and watched The Jerk, Roxanne, and The Three Amigos in steady rotation. Even throughout my various relationships, no one had held a candle to him. He was a genius in my eyes. My ardor had only matured as I became aware of his other work. He'd been the main reason I began sporadically buying The New Yorker, and along with the CD of his banjo playing with the Earl Scruggs Band, I also own several copies of his books and the issue of People magazine that rightfully named him one of their 50 most beautiful. And then I'm just going to fast forward a little bit to the faulty fuse chapter. However, working with the Bremen crew continued to test my patience. They were consistently arrogant and bossy, and I'd grown to dread our joint strategy meetings. Aaron wasn't involved in these, but I still held him accountable for being associated with such a terrible group of people. And in my opinion, Aaron had let slip enough comments to prove that he shared their basic condescension. He swore that I had misinterpreted these, but I knew that I hadn't. Aaron had listened to my charges, reiterated how much he respected the work I did, and started making me breakfast most mornings as atonement for being part of the Bremen staff. Lucky for him, I'd forgive almost anything for a steady supply of pancakes, though I warned him that he would have to change jobs soon if we were to progress as a couple. He nodded and added chocolate chips to the batter that morning. At work, I fell easily into the new routine of lobbying and strategizing. Every day, we updated a large chart that indicated how the relevant lawmakers were most inclined to vote on the bill based on whatever new information we had managed to gather. The second week of September, we got an unexpected publicity boost with the release of 2 separate studies from well-respected institutions that claimed that a government-funded healthcare system like the one currently in place in Canada would save the United States $200 billion a year, which was more than enough money to cover the costs of the nearly 44 million Americans currently without health insurance. The articles about the studies invariably cited the prescription drug benefit proposal as America's attempt to move closer to such a progressive system. As I sifted through this beneficial coverage, I was briefly distracted by a distressingly fawning story about Borden Dent, actor turned presidential aspirant. Dent had been parading around in his Prada cowboy boots from one press conference to the next, signing autographs and flashing his trademark smile. He'd portrayed a president twice in the movies and often pointed to these parts as great preparation for the job he sought. He'd also played a psychotic alien, giant ape, and a retarded man with a bad southern accent, but I had yet to hear him touting the learning experiences of these roles. There was still time. I was clicking out of the Borden Dent article and back into the bill work when a breaking news alert informed me that a rolling blackout had just left Cleveland and Toledo powerless. I turned on the TV and watched the footage. There were hordes of disrupted commuters wandering on foot in a sort of aimless weave down the middle of streets rendered disorderly by defunct traffic lights. Where did our rules go without electricity? Apparently, they got absorbed into some sort of primitive hive mind that emerged to fill the void left by the abrupt disappearance of the manufactured power we'd come to rely so heavily upon. Anchormen warned that looting might begin at nightfall. Until then, the city seemed ruled by a streaming sense of purposelessness. A quick-thinking power grid monitor had apparently acted in time to prevent the blackout from spreading to the eastern seaboard, sparing millions the stress and frustration currently befalling the residents of Ohio. The preliminary reports indicated that the blackout hadn't been caused by any individual company's negligence, but was more a casualty of the grossly outdated power grid that RG had been warning about for some time. I learned early on that RG was better than most at seeing the bigger picture and was occasionally ridiculed for it by those who made their careers out of capitalizing on smaller, safer political issues. RG wasn't a doomsayer. He always had a proactive plan for combating the problems he pointed to. but his detractors wrote him off as a pessimistic exaggerator. The fact that he'd been proven right time and time again, they refused to address or accept. RG immediately called for more hearings on the topic before getting on a plane to Ohio to tour the hospitals, water plants, and community centers and offer whatever support and assistance he could provide. I spent the rest of the day updating the position chart and helping answer the hundreds of calls swamping the office lines. By dinner time, I was short of breath from talking to so many people, worried about loved ones they hadn't yet heard from. I also felt dizzy and lightheaded, the beginning signs of a panic attack. Some people got sympathy pains. I got sympathy disorders. Thankfully, power returned to northern Ohio sometime during the night before too much damage had been done. RG completed his tour and rejoined us on the hill, where the rest of the week blazed by in a caffeinated blur of blackout recovery and bill lobbying. The surprise crisis had served to double our normal workload, but I'd learned to expect the unexpected in this job and simply adjust my schedule accordingly. As I headed into the office that Saturday to make my way through a stack of paperwork, I noted that it was the 65th anniversary of Seabiscuit's win over War Admiral at Pimlico. To celebrate, I ducked into a corner store and bought some scratch stickers adorned with horses, which ended up winning me a free Slurpee. I chose the cherry-flavored kind and arrived at work a little hyper from all the sugar. Mark was also in the office, looking a bit stressed. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I asked. "RG may be doing Russert tomorrow," he answered, making talking signs with his hands. Interesting. That was great, if a little surprising. Brayman had been sucking up most of the press oxygen around the bill, relegating RG to a lower profile but very crucial lobbying role. As I watched Mark walk quickly away, I realized that I hadn't seen much of him in the last few weeks, which was abnormal since our office was not that large. He used to come up with any excuse to shyly wander past my desk, but now it was almost as though he'd been purposely avoiding me. 2 hours later, he appeared beside my desk. "Listen, Sammy," he began, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you for a little while now." "Sure, Mark, go for it," I replied. "Well, you know when you have something you need to say, but you're pretty sure the other person isn't going to want to hear it? That's sort of what I've been struggling with," he continued laboriously. Oh gosh, what was this? I noticed his hands had remained uncharacteristically motionless throughout his speech. I said cautiously. "Well, I think I already know the answer to this, but, are you and Aaron exclusive? There's a reason I'm asking." "Oh, no. I already knew the reason, but did we really have to talk about it? Weren't we past this?" I couldn't deal with a vocalized crush for Mark. His feelings for me had been obvious all along. Well, at least since Mona had pointed them out to me. Didn't he know there wasn't any chance of us getting together? Having been on the other end of painfully unrequited crushes more times than I like to count, I had no desire to be the person stringing someone else along. I liked Mark and was annoyed that he seemed determined to make things permanently uncomfortable between us. I took a deep breath. I needed to put an end to this as definitively as I could while still being kind. "Yeah, we are, Mark. Look, I really like working with you and think you're a cool person, but you've got to move on. There are plenty of other women who'd be tremendously lucky to date you. Possibly 1 or 2 of them right here in this very office, but not me. I'm with Aaron, and I don't think we should talk anymore about it, okay? I had involuntarily closed my eyes somewhere in the middle of my spiel, as though I didn't want to watch it unfold. It was certainly easier to get through when I didn't have to look at Mark's face. Now that I had opened my eyes, I saw that his skin had turned a deep pink color, and he looked supremely embarrassed. Ooh, I should have kept them closed. That's not what I was gonna... Never mind, he stammered. Just forget I was gonna say anything. It was a bad idea, he said as he hurried off. Alright, that was agonizing but necessary. Mark had needed to be disavowed of any lingering romantic illusions. I hoped we could be friends, but even if we couldn't, at least there wouldn't be any misunderstanding between us. I returned to my work with a resigned resolve. I made it back home by 4 o'clock, which helped me feel like I hadn't really put in a full day of work on the weekend. Any time before 7 o'clock didn't count as a full day. When I walked in the front door, Shackleton was suspended diagonally facing downwards in his fishbowl. His gills were beating sluggishly, indicating some slivers of remaining life, but I had just about had enough. I used my special crime corner camera to snap a Polaroid of his latest death pose and marched the evidence down to Mr. Lee's pet store. You didn't flush him yet? Mr. Lee asked in horror as I presented the photo. Oh, right. The last Mr. Lee had heard, Shackleton had perished months ago. No, I wasn't keeping him around Norman Bates style. I wrinkled my nose at the thought of the smell. No, he's still alive, but just barely, I clarified. I know I said he was dead on that message, but it turned out he wasn't. He just pretends to be dead all the time. It's very disconcerting. I need something to make him better. Mr. Lee looked thoughtful and concerned for a few moments. Oh, stop presses. I have just thought something, he cried, his face lighting up. Come look, come look. I followed him back to the fish tank section, where I glanced bitterly at a slew of hale and hearty looking Japanese fighting fish. Shackleton had once looked similarly sneakily healthy. Mr. Lee pointed to a corner of their tank, specifically at some bright purple seaweed. Just in, he exclaimed. You must try. It make all the difference. How much is it? I asked suspiciously. For you, preferred customer? A special deal, he answered. Back at home, and $20 later, I cleaned Shackleton's bowl and refilled it with the seaweed remedy. But when I returned him to his hangout, he went straight to the bottom to lie down on the rocks, completely ignoring the new addition. Maybe he just needed a little while to notice it. I wasn't ready to give up hope just yet. I had plans to meet Aaron later that evening once he finished his drafting a speech Brayman was scheduled to give at the AFL-CIO convention. He'd been working at Brayman's Georgetown townhouse since early morning, but expected to be released in time for dinner as the senator and his wife had symphony plans. Even though I'd also had to work on a Saturday, I felt resentful that Aaron's irksome job continued to cut into our together time. I wouldn't have minded as much were he working for a cause I deemed worthy, but that wasn't the case. And he'd been traveling so much lately, our relationship had begun to resemble a commuter one. The only upshot of this tense arrangement was that it made me really value the nights we set aside to be alone together. I'd read somewhere that successful marriages often depended on such date night strategies, so perhaps this was all good practice for the future. I took a hot shower and a long